welcome. It's a nice afternoon outside, but I'm sure it's going to be a far more interesting and exciting conversation in here. On behalf of CSEP, it is my honor and privilege to welcome all of you to this important gathering on the theme Global Trade Uncertainty and India's Policy Dilemmas. As you know, CSEP, I'm going to talk a little bit about CSEP for those of you who don't know of our work. We conduct in-depth policy relevant research, which is empirical, data-driven, non-political, uh, and on basically on challenges facing India, the global south, and the world. And it draws on expertise of its researchers, extensive interactions with policymakers, as well as its convening power to enhance the impact and quality of work. Our researchers work across many domains. We have about 100 plus scholars working on macroeconomy, foreign policy, environment, climate change, energy, health, education, mining, and there are a couple of others as well. And it's a multidisciplinary group. So we have people who are studied economics, who come from a policy making background, who are engineers, lawyers, foreign policy professionals. So we are not just economist driven, though both our esteemed panelists are. The global trade environment is something that I need not talk about. We all know it's going to be extremely exciting and extremely painful as well. That is clear, but how it will pan out, we really don't know. And for that, we are very, very glad to have two amazing panelists today who've spent a lifetime of work, not just on international trade, but also on political economy. And let me welcome first Pravin. Welcome. Dr. Pravin Krishna is a Chung Young Distinguished Professor of International Economics and Business, Johns Hopkins University. His research areas include international economics, and I had said political economy, and of course, the Indian economy as well. He has published articles across in all the top journals, including American Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, Economics and Politics, and co-edited the World Trade System Trends and Challenges of 2016. He completed his BTech from IIT Mumbai and MA, MPhil, and PhD in economics from Columbia University. His previous appointments include those at Brown, Chicago, Columbia, Princeton, and Stanford universities. And he's also been a consultant to the World Bank and IMF. Welcome. Amita Batra is currently a professor of economics at JNU. She had a much more interesting position earlier when she was a senior fellow at CSEP. She has been a member of the G20 advisory group for 22-23, B20 India Task Force on GVCs and Global Trade of 2023. She's held positions at the University of Edinburgh, University of Sydney, IIM Ahmedabad, and ICRIER. She has published many articles and books, including India's trade policy in the 21st century, and writes Straight Talk, column for Business Standard. She has an MA, MPhil, and PhD in economics from Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi. Welcome back, Amita, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lavish. And I don't think I'm going to take much time introducing the subject. We are all in the midst of a change that's happening in the US, consequently in the world, and trade probably has been at the center of it all for some time, preceding Trump's assuming office, President Trump's assuming office. And for times after, I think this is going to spill over for some months, years, probably, you know. I do want to start, however, with a comment and a question. I think as far as the topic is concerned, we're talking about global trade uncertainty and India's policy dilemmas. I would want to say here, you know, that as far as India's trade policy is concerned, it has in the last two and a half decades moved at variance with what has been happening in the world. At least this is how I see it, and I read the trade policy as it has evolved in these last two and a half decades in India. Very different from what the rest of the world has been doing, probably reflective of both the tendency as far as India is concerned to remain concentrated on demand from within rather than looking at exports as a means of demand. Also, slightly the inherently protectionist tendencies that have been evident as far as India's trade policy is concerned. I hope we are moving away from it. Today, as we see the world evolving, I think trade is at the center of the world international relations, international politics, geopolitics, and so on, you know. I have to say, though, that post President Trump's assumption of office, I do not really see him in the first few orders that he has given a significant reflection of what he had been saying prior to it, particularly with respect to China. There is an Office of Trade Policy that he has set up for revenue purposes, looking at trade policies, trade balance, currency manipulation, etc. That's a broad spectrum specification of what are important issues that might come up during his tenure. But what is he actually going to do? I think we'll be left wondering, and probably we'll have to grapple with it as we move along. Now over to Pravin, Professor Pravin Krishna, who's already been introduced. Over to you for your presentation, Global Trade Uncertainty, India's Policy Dilemmas. Hope we'll have, not hope, but I'm sure we'll have lots to question you on up to that, please.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to speak from here, is okay? Yeah. Should I turn this other mic off or switch it off? All right, there you go. All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's my first time at CSEP, so an additional pleasure. Thank you to Professor Batra and CSEP for organizing this. Great to see familiar faces, Navesh, Dr. Mohan. All right, so with that, let me get started with the topic, global trade uncertainty and India's policy options. I was warned that you're a very chatty crowd, and so I'm going to keep my formal comments to sort of a minimum, and then we'll open it up to Q&A and have a good discussion. Okay, so the outline for the talk that I had planned is as follows. I just wanted to spend a minute or two discussing India's development trajectory, essentially pointing out what would be sort of essentially, I think what most of you know about the broad structural transformation challenges for India, the need to get out of agriculture into industry and services, the employment challenges arising out of India's demographics and so on, and the fact that despite the obvious need for India to leverage global markets and through exports and kind of, generate jobs more specifically using global markets, that for most part, this has been kind of a relatively unsuccessful enterprise for us. Our export footprint remains quite low. So these are kind of background facts, I suppose, that I'd want to go through fairly quickly. And then I want to move on to the particular global challenges that I want to discuss. So just to list these, and I'll go through these in detail, of course. The first would just be the WTO, the very broad trends over the last 2, 3, 4 decades. And the main point that I'll make is that while the WTO, the GATT before it, started out as a multilateral platform whose core idea, organizing principle, and the principle that differentiated the GATT from all trade agreements prior to it was the principle of non-discrimination, right? So this is the core idea. That in recent decades, starting the late 1980s, you've seen a very systematic deviation from that idea. So you've gone away from countries, starting with the United States and through NAFTA, and so the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, the extension to Mexico to form NAFTA, and so on, in the 1990s, moved away from this very kind of robust multilateral platform in a much more kind of bilateral direction, right? That has implications for India, that has created a kind of a weakening of the multilateral architecture that served a variety of countries very well. And I'll talk a bit about what India has done sort of in response to that and how successful we have or have not been in that context. A second point has to do with, in terms of just kind of the global picture, is these emerging forces in a number of countries that are pushing in the direction of deglobalization, a kind of a resurgence of economic nationalism. You see this in the United States, of course, and we'll talk a bit about that. But in other countries as well, you see what happened with Brexit, the desire of the UK to kind of leave the European Union, and so on, and so the European sort of the exit from the EU and so on and so forth. And I want to say that this is not merely, even in the United States, this is not merely a sort of a Trump phenomenon, right? So this idea that globalization could have been harmful, the idea that globalization could have caused increased sort of economic inequalities, is an idea that finds support not just in sort of certain political quarters, like, the Trump people, but there are a number of academics, a number of very prominent academic papers that have written about this, the strong belief that engaging in international trade with developing countries, with China in particular, has actually increased income inequality in the US and so forth. So that idea that globalization might have harmed the US, might have harmed other countries, finds some sympathy in sort of academic quarters on the one hand. There are economic isolationists, economic nationalists that have been around for very long periods of time that have similar ideas, thinking about why it is that the US, for instance, should engage with any other countries at all, but more specifically, why the US should submit itself to rules of international organizations, right? So why should we have a WTO tell us what to do? Why should we have a United Nations tell us what to do? So it's a different group of people, different from these academics who worry about income inequality and these sorts of issues. And then you have a kind of a national security driven set of concerns about China in particular, one about Chinese economic growth, second about Chinese sort of potential threats arising from China's rising strengths on the economic sphere that spill over into kind of national security type of issues. So there's a multi-dimensional sort of dialogue there. And I think it would be a mistake for anybody here or just in general to sort of locate all of that just on Trump and say, this is a Trump phenomenon. This runs a bit deeper than that. And I'll talk a bit about that as well. The consequence of all of this has been, of course, a bunch of geopolitical uncertainty. On the one hand, you have US-China as a major issue, how exactly it is that the US is going to deal with China's rise. We've already seen some of this in the form of Trump 1.0. I should mention quickly that the main economic policies that were pursued by Trump with respect to China, the US-China trade war, while at that time, many believed that this was, again, a sort of a Trump set of policies, I should point out that the Biden administration did not reverse a single of these, right? So if tariffs were imposed on roughly $400 billion worth of trade with the Chinese, maybe there was a reversal of tariffs on about $7, $8, $10 billion at most with the Biden administration, which is reflective yet again of something deeper, a kind of a bipartisan consensus in the US about the need to sort of deal with China in some way, right? Whether that was wise or not, it's another. Another point, and maybe I'll stop with the list here, is the very obvious and continuing dominance of China in manufacturing, a certain type of, what I would call a super dominance, right? So it's worth sort of pausing and recognizing that despite everything that happened from 2016 on with respect to US assaults on China with respect to trade policies, right? The US-China trade war. Despite all of that, right? Trade has risen, and you've all seen the statistics, I'm sure, from this last week about the Chinese trade deficit having reached $1 trillion, right? Surplus, sorry. So percentage of manufacturing output, percentage of manufacturing exports, surplus, it just continues. Despite everything that has actually happened, despite all of the pressures within the international system. And that's really quite remarkable and creates specific challenges for India to deal. In particular, for those, including myself, who had imagined that the US-China trade war might create some kind of opportunity for India. People talked about a China +1 sort of strategy and so on and so forth. It's proven to be much more difficult than maybe many had imagined to kind of enter that space and to get into those areas where China, potentially we might have imagined would vacate and so on and so forth. That clearly has not happened to the extent that we had hoped, and that's not happened to the extent that many other countries had hoped in the rest of the world either. So we'll get to trade policy options. Very clearly, there's things you can do unilaterally, there's things you can do on a bilateral basis through trade agreements and so forth, and in kind of in a multilateral structure, and we'll talk a bit about what this. So very, very quickly, a fact that you all know, stagnation of manufacturing, share of output has been very, very steady, right? And this is despite the very remarkable and very impressive reforms undertaken by India in starting in the early 90s, in fact, prior as well. You see a very, very steady share. These are the kind of the lines and kind of the light blue over here. whether you look at output shares, employment shares, very steady manufacturing. The one noteworthy fact here is that agriculture is, we have 45% of the workforce in agriculture producing just 15% of the output. These relative productivities of the other sectors relative to agriculture are quite high, which has created this kind of consensus view, I think, that maybe one should be exiting agriculture, getting workers out to the other sectors, but at least with respect to industry, that has not happened at the rate at which it will. If you compare this with transitions in other countries, if you look at the US, when was the US at this sort of stage where you had 45% of the manufacture, or 45% of the employment in agriculture? That was well over 100 years ago. If you look at what the numbers are today, it's maybe 1 or 2% of the workforce that's producing enough food for the whole country, in contrast to where we are. That's a historical number. These are transitions for South Asia, and I'll show you China in a second, but just a very remarkable rise in sort of manufacturing share of employment. There's about 30% at its peak for the South Koreans. And in a sense, I think in the 1990s or kind of early 2000s, this was the kind of picture we had hoped would emerge for India, and it has not quite panned out in the same way. Chinese value, kind of the manufacturing value added in red here is sort of seen rising very rapidly, as you can see, once again, the kind of picture that we had hoped would happen in India, which is not. The consequences of this are at one level obvious. We have significant demographic pressures, a very young population, the need for job creation, and so forth. And with these very large export markets out there, right, it seems fairly obvious that you connect the dots in that way, that you use these export markets to create jobs in the way that these other countries have done. And once again, this has not happened at the rate at which one might have hoped. Our share in merchandise exports have grown from maybe 0.5%, I'm sorry, in 1990 to about 2%. This is much, much smaller than where China is, for example. Services, we've obviously done better, but the trade footprint is overall quite small. This is a plot of India versus China, and it's obviously not very flattering. The other dominant, one dominant fact of international trade in the last couple of decades is emergence of global value chains, production fragmentation, no one country producing a good entirely by itself. And many other countries, especially neighbors in Asia, have done very well in using this structure, using global value chains to advance their economies. And India's share in value chains is unfortunately also quite small. I'm sort of being very, very quick here about this, but you all would have seen, no doubt, the magisterial work by Professor Batra here, discussing all of these in the Indian context and the Asian context and our policies as well, and where they've fallen short. But just to point out that if one looked at sort of participation in global value chains, there's a number of different ways of measuring this, but India is going to come in very, very. In addition to this, so there's the broad facts of kind of low exports, low export performance. I want to point out 2 or 3 things here that are worth noting as well when we think about our export performance, because once we start thinking about which policies might we need to sort of put in place or reform to improve trade performance, and some of these facts are important to know. The first of these is that on top of the fact that export performance has been sort of weak, there's an obvious sort of distortion in the pattern of international trade, for you, right? Which is to say that the factor intensity, like what's embodied in our exports, does not reflect India's factor abundance. Right? So the standard textbook theories of international trade will say you're going to be the factor intensities of your exports, what it is that you're exporting, are going to reflect the factors that you have in your countries in abundance. In India, that's going to be low skilled labor. And unfortunately, the sectors in which we've done really well with respect to exports have been skilled labor intensive and maybe even capital intensive exports, right? This is a very, very strong contrast with China, where the picture could not be more consistent with the theory, right? So China's export growth is textbook sort of, these are textbook pictures really. When they started their export boom, it was all unskilled labor intensive. As you have skill accumulation, as you have capital accumulation, steadily gone up the path of skill intensity and capital intensity in their exports. It works like a perfectly functioning sort of market economy in a certain sense, right? And ours, interestingly, that is not the case, right? We don't have this. I have a number of figures I could show you, but after the presentation, but this is, one can look at this in multiple ways and sort of come to the same conclusion. There's some distortions here that need to be dealt with. The second fact is sort of low scale and low productivity, right? And so you see here, if you look at the fraction of Indian firms in manufacturing that are small, this is a kind of a shocking contrast with China, a very strong contrast with most of the other countries in Asia as well. In fact, if you look at sort of the number of firms, a fraction of firms that are micro, small, et cetera, less than 50 workers, less than 10 workers, India is going to be at the top of that list relative to our neighbors. Why does this matter? Productivity is very directly related to scale. You see here, got a labor productivity for workers in 200 plus firms, 200 plus worker firms is 5 times as high as those firms, as workers in firms which are, just 20 workers or so. Similar charts can be seen for other countries, but in India in particular, this is very strong. So we have a problem of low scale. A final point that is, and maybe some of you knew this, but I certainly was surprised when by this when I went through the data, is the export concentration, right? Which is to say that if you look at Indian customs transactions data, which is what is shown here, it surprised me to see how few firms actually dominate the entire picture. Okay? So this picture is indicating this is a cumulative distribution base, essentially telling you that 5% of Indian firms account for about 85% of our exports. 5% of exporting entities, I should say Indian firms. It's a much smaller number of Indian firms, but 5% of exporting entities account for 85%. It's 10% is like close to 90, 95, and actually 2.5% account for 75% of Indian exports. So it's the number of Indian customs data. There's maybe 100,000 plus exporting entities, and just 1,000, 2,000 of these account for vast fractions of the overall picture, which raises interesting questions as well for policy as to what one needs to do. Okay, so these are all sort of facts about the Indian economy. Let me get to the kind of the global picture, right? So the WTO, the GATT WTO multilateral architecture, which was non-discriminatory in nature, served the system very, very well. In place between, so the GATT was in place between 1950 and 1955. The WTO 1995, the WTO came in place in 1995. You saw remarkable benefits from this, massive reductions in tariffs, massive increases in international trade. Right? During this period, we have a bit of an asynchronous relationship with the rest of the world, and I think you were referring to that. Professor Batra was referring to that a bit earlier, which is while the rest of the world was going through these massive liberalizations and benefiting from international trade, India, for most part, was a closed economy, right? Or it had reached a stage where it was really quite closed. Just at the time that India got ready with its own very impressive liberalizations of the early 1990s, the world started to move away from this multilateral architecture towards bilateralism. So you're talking about the various agreements. Of course, the European Union was always there as the one sort of big agreement prior to the 1990s, sort of a bilateral agreement of a certain sort. But starting from the 1990s, you saw a very, very large number. This is a chart of the number of preferential trade agreements that were negotiated starting just the 1990s. You see a complete takeoff in these, and you see a very, very sort of complicated network of agreements. By this point now, you have bilateralism run amok. You have countries that are on average members of 7 or 8 different agreements. This is what's been famously referred to as the spaghetti bowl of agreements by Jagdish Bhagwati, right? And his point in saying that was to say that the rules of the game, which were fairly sort of clear and systematic and multilateral and so on and so forth, and non-discriminatory, all of a sudden you're dealing with a much more complicated world where rules have become almost bilateral. A given country has to figure out where a good is coming from. There's multiple different rules that apply to imports depending on the country that they're coming from and so on and so forth. So it's become a much more complicated and messy world. Right? Despite that, we've had our own sort of interest in bilateral agreements. It came a bit late, so I think around mid-2000s, India started to get into bilateral agreements of its own. So we entered the spaghetti bowl, and not with very great success, right? So I'll show you those graphs in a second. But just to say that as the just as we started to think about bilateral agreements, right, and started to sign agreements of our own, and maybe started to get a little more ambitious with our agreements, the world is now starting to move away from all of this, right? There's a kind of a deglobalization, globalization, whatever it is that you want to say, and countries even wanting to get out of agreements that they've already signed, Brexit being one example, the US with respect to TPP being another example, and so on and so forth. There's been a kind of a clearly asynchronous relationship of India with the rest of it. So now coming to sort of India's trade agreements. We've signed a bunch of these agreements, and what you see here is the particular modality through which they were notified to the GATT. And this is something worth a minute of your time as well, I think. So Article 24 of the GATT, 1947, essentially said, notwithstanding non-discrimination in the world, right, as a central principle of the GATT, you can get into preferential agreements with each other if you have very substantial agreements, right? So you really need to liberalize everything for all practical purposes. So if you're interested in a total economic integration, liberalization of tariffs on everything, then Article 24 says, let's set non-discrimination aside. You guys can get into an agreement with each other, okay? And so that's the basis for the European Union. That's the basis for NAFTA. That's the basis for a variety of other agreements. Many years later, in the Tokyo round, 1970s, was introduced something else called the enabling clause, right? And so very quickly, the enabling clause permitted developing countries to enter into preferential agreements, which violated non-discriminatory spirit of the GATT, but it did not insist that the agreements that you get into had to be complete agreements or deep agreements, right? So you can get into, through the enabling clause, get into a preferential agreement in which maybe you've one good, I did one good for you, and you did one good for me. We can call that a trade agreement if we're both developing countries, notify that to the GATT through the enabling clause. We look at the list of Indian agreements, this is through 2005 to 2019, although they're all called free trade agreement, this and free trade agreement, that, and so forth, the vast majority are enabling clause agreements, which is to say that the amount of liberalization and the type of liberalization actually undertaken in these agreements was very, very limited, right? On top of the fact that they're limited, there's a number of other issues we could be discussing about the limitations of these agreements. Limited liberalization with a phase-in period that's 10 years, 15 years, and so on and so forth. And so when one looks at what the impact has actually been of these bilateral agreements, it's been very, very modest, right? So this is trade under bilateral agreements as a fraction of overall trade. And you see that this is completely steady over the period under kind of consideration over here, but it's 2007 to 2017. So I kind of excluded the years leading up to COVID and the post-COVID years and so forth. But this picture does not look very different if you considered more recent years. A number of reasons for this low impact. I've already mentioned a couple: very partial liberalization, so on and so forth, phased in liberalization, complicated rules of origin with limited take-up because of the complications of the rules themselves. All right. There was one important opportunity for us to get into a very substantial agreement. That was the RCEP agreement. And in 2019, we decided not to do that. Okay? So, and as I understand it, until the very last second, at least, it looked like we might sign the deal. And then we exited the deal, having spent quite a bit of time negotiating this agreement or negotiating our entry into this. This was the explanation that one hears is that this was a fear of China. This is kind of trade with China, imports versus exports, and the increasing trade deficits with China, and the increasing presence of China in India's import basket made us worry about how much worse this picture would get if you actually got into a free trade agreement with the Chinese and had goods flowing in freely, one way or the other. That would have offered us an important opportunity to engage with a really truly substantial trade agreement. and maybe given us this opportunity to get into global value chains in a way that we had not had before. And this is now not being discussed. There have been a few recent agreements that look a little more ambitious. The agreement with the UAE, the agreement with Australia, and so forth. Ambitious, at least in terms of the fraction of goods that were actually liberalized. But that being said, I'm not sure what the volume of trade was in the first place, what kind of tariffs. You look at what the UAE had in terms of tariffs against India, in these tariffs against anybody in the first place are about 2%, 3%. So getting those knocked back to zero is nice to have, but not going to be game changer. Okay. There are opportunities still in this space when we think about what is still possible, right? So there's the version of the TPP that is still there that the US left, now called the CP TPP, a very large agreement. I think they account for maybe 13, 15% of global output, somewhere in that range, maybe a similar number for world exports. I suppose we could consider joining the CPTPP. That will give us some access to markets in Asia and so forth, some opportunities to get into these global value chains that we've been discussing. But as I understand it, nothing specific is on the cards. There's always discussion about a US-India free trade agreement. I'm not sure how much appetite there is for this, either in the US or in India. The agreement with the Europeans has been negotiated for a very long time. I'm not sure where things stand. So this seems, this is not necessarily a great point for us with respect to those agreements. From the standpoint of GVCs and so on, I guess one thing I will add is that we've actually harmed ourselves a bit here as well by a unilateral policy, right? So on top of the fact that we didn't have access through particular free trade agreements to these networks, unilateral tariffs have actually risen over time a bit, a particular jump in 2017, 2018, from an average of, a little below 15%, maybe 12, 13, 14% to something like 18, 19%. These create frictions in international trade of the sort that are wholly not necessary. Okay, so with this, let me move on, maybe spend the last 5-10 minutes here on current challenges. Donald Trump, the WTO, right? One of the first things that Trump did in his first, I think he did this on his first day, Trump 1.0, so this is 2016, was to get out of an agreement that the US had spent maybe nearly 20 years negotiating, which was the TPP, right? So first day said, we're out of this. He had promised it in his campaign, so it's no great surprise. The other, which was considerably more surprising to most, was his willingness to forget about non-discrimination and to forget about the basic architecture of the WTO and essentially say, we're going to be insisting on good by good reciprocity, country by country reciprocity. So if you put a 10% tariff on our cars, we're going to put a 10% tariff on your cars. Somebody else gives us 20%. We're going to put 20% on them. The fact that this is completely illegal from a WTO GATT standpoint is irrelevant. We really don't care. We're going to find some legal mechanisms to get around this. And they did, right? One of these was the national security clause, right? Which is provided for in the GATT, which says that if you feel a threat to national security, then you're permitted to, apply tariffs as you wish, or withdraw from trade with a particular country as you wish. And this can be on a discriminatory basis. This doesn't have to be the same high tariff on all different countries. It was very sort of unusual for anybody to invoke this national security clause. It had only been done, a couple of times before in the GATT's history when it was not a context of war. And the Trump administration wasn't very shy in using this national security window to essentially assert that aluminum was of national security importance, that steel was of national security importance, and various other things were of national security importance, and that we're going to use these things to deviate from existing GATT commitments. The other big thing was the assault essentially on the dispute settlement mechanism. So one of the great achievements of 1995 and the creation of the WTO was that what you saw was put in place was the dispute settlement mechanism of the GATT, which was utilized very heavily, utilized equally by developing and developed countries. It's actually a good mechanism to have in place, but it has, there's the appellate part of it has judges that need to be that need to be reappointed and so forth. They have 3 or 4 year terms. And systematically through the Biden administration, sorry, the Obama administration, Trump administration, they refuse to reappoint the judges to the extent that there are actually no judges left at the WTO, right? So all of these challenges against Trump's policies by China, by India, by other countries have been submitted to the WTO. They've also been ruled on initially, but all the US has to do is to throw this back to the appellate system, and then it disappears into the void because there's no judges left to bench this case. And that's the situation as of today, right? So it's a very convenient sort of structure for the US to have because it enables you to do whatever you like and then not be challenged. One of the other things I already mentioned was what was surprising was not just that this was done, it was surprising to begin with, meaning the destruction of the dispute settlement mechanism, but the persistence of that policy under the Biden administration, right? So the Biden administration could easily have said, all right, now that we're here, we're going to start appointing judges and so on and so forth. They did not do that, right? Which suggests something important about what's going on with respect to US political economy. There's a bipartisan agreement, in a sense, that the WTO system maybe has outlived its usefulness from a US standpoint relative to US political imperatives, political economy of the US and so forth. And so the Biden administration has not done anything with respect to that. And one should not then expect Trump 2.0 to change that either. You've all heard about the various proposals by Trump, but just quickly, 10 to 20% tariffs on all imports, potentially a 60% additional tariff on China. There's some proposal to create what he's calling an external revenue service. And at various points, he's mentioned that he's going to replace completely sort of income taxes. So forget about income taxes. Let's not have any income taxes anymore. We'll just generate all the tax revenues we need through external tax, right? And so the last time the US was financed to such an extent where 90% of US government expenditure was financed by trade taxes was maybe in 1840 or something like that, right? So he's talking about taking the system back all the way back there. It's clearly infeasible and totally ridiculous. And it will not work, right? Even if they had the maximum possible trade taxes, it's not going to generate enough revenue to make up for income taxes that you would lose if you just gave up on income taxes. But this is the nature of the conversation that has been coming out of him and his campaign. One thing to note, and sometimes this question gets asked, is isn't it the case that in the US, Congress actually has authority over trade policy? Congress has authority over taxation and so on and so forth. And that is actually true, right? So in a kind of a structural sense, constitutional sense, Congress has authority. However, there are particular windows, particular contexts in which that authority can be transferred to the president, right? So if it is a national security issue, president gets that authority back. If there's an allegation of unfair trade practices, the president gets that authority back. And it's not a coincidence that Trump has used both of these to implement the tariffs that he wanted. But what is slightly surprising is that once you accuse a country of unfair trade practices, a case actually has to be made with the Department of Commerce and so forth. And I would have thought that there'd be at least a little bit of pushback from the Department of Commerce in the US against what was going on. And there simply wasn't. So every single accusation that Trump had of unfair trading practices against other countries was ultimately sort of ratified, if you will, by the Department of Commerce, right? All this being said, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. We were just talking about this before as well. It's not quite clear if Trump is just operating in a kind of pure negotiation mode, where these are a bunch of threats that you drop on countries and see what they might do for you, or if this is actually real, because the numbers have changed so many times. So much of what he's talking about is infeasible as well, replacement of internal taxes with external taxes and so forth. So there's a truly tremendous level of uncertainty. Nobody seems to know. People close to him don't necessarily know. He himself may not know exactly which way he's headed. To push back a bit against his potential excesses, some countries have taken, Canada in particular, has taken this sort of aggressive position and posture of saying, first of all, we will retaliate. And not only are we going to retaliate, we're going to retaliate specifically on these goods. And these are going to be goods that affect people that live in Republican states and that are going to hurt you and they're going to hurt your friends. Okay? And the list of that goods has already been published by the Canadians, right? I imagine, maybe this is not true, but that India is working up a list of this sort as well. That if there's tariffs that are put on India, then what particular retaliation should we pursue? Maybe we're doing this, maybe we're not. That could be one approach that one takes of a very specific set of counter threats against the particular tariff threats that or tariff policies that Trump might put in place. The other would be actually to reconsider a bit our own tariff structure, right? So it's not, it wouldn't be crazy to say, are there a set of goods where we actually have very high tariffs, right? So tariff peaks in India can be very large as well. Our average tariffs are, lower, they're a little higher than where they used to be, but particular goods, motorcycles, alcohol, and so on and so forth, it is possible that you throw something back as a concession to Trump, allow him to score a win, and that might sort of offset some of the pressure that one faces. But whether it's going to be successful or not is anybody's guess. But maybe one could see this as an opportunity for us to rationalize our own tariff structure, maybe lower tariffs on imports, just in general, lower tariffs on imports, which are tariffs that are particularly high. The very last thing is China. I mentioned already that the Chinese manufacturing express continues, great momentum, despite all of the challenges that they faced since 2016. They've done remarkably well. The $1 trillion trade surplus figure that we saw earlier this month is an indication of that, and that creates particular issues for India, right? So there's the obvious fact that this China plus one story has not panned out in the way that we might have hoped, and maybe it's not quite as easy to get into these spaces as we had imagined. There's a separate question just about our bilateral relations with the Chinese, right? There's been a lot of discussion, at least some discussion in various circles about what it actually means and what it would mean for us to trade a lot with China. Are we exposing ourselves to a certain type of dependence on China? So these are some figures that I thought I'd share with you. What this is giving you is our India and the US import dependence on China, right? So if you look at sort of our fraction of imports that come from China, this is a 4-digit industry. So there's roughly 1,200 of these industries, right? And you kind of order them, the distribution of it. And you look at what fraction of imports in any given industry is coming from China. And these are the different percentiles, right? So if you look at the 95th percentile of this, 85% of our imports are coming in from China. So essentially the top 5% of those industries. If you come all the way down even to the 75th percentile, so 25% of our industries, so that's about 1/4 of 1,200, 400 industries, you're looking at about 50%. That number is 50%. It's quite high. So you have a high level of dependence on China. There's actually reasonably high dependence in the US as well, right? Although it's smaller than what you see in India, which is to say the 95th percentile is about 65%. So 5% of the industries have more than, or about 65% of their imports coming in from China. Okay? Where there's an asymmetry is on the export side. So if you look and say, if our import dependence on China is sort of similar to the US, in fact, similar to many other countries in the world, where do we stand in terms of their dependence on us, right? China's dependence on us. And that picture looks very different for the US than it does for India, right? So this is what fraction, so once again, the industry is organized by, share in China's global exports. And if you look at our 95th percentile, right, we're only 20% of what China's exporting to us is only 20% of their total exports. And the corresponding figure for the US is over 50%, which is to say that if you think about interdependence as being a disciplinary mechanism to sort of prevent crazy actions on either sides, then the US is in a much more powerful position relative to India, given where this is. And so this creates certain dilemmas. I don't know that there's an obvious answer here, but clearly shutting down trade with China altogether can't be the answer. One might have to be very careful about choosing industries or identifying maybe a narrow set of industries that are particularly sensitive from a national security standpoint or otherwise, and trying to figure out how one goes about trade in those sectors, and everywhere else maybe pursuing trade just like everybody else has. Okay, let me conclude with the following thoughts. One is that our initial round of unilateral reforms, which are very impressive and really very large in magnitude, starting in the 1990s, thereabouts, only succeeded partially because of relatively low domestic productivity, whether that's infrastructural weaknesses, technological weaknesses, scale, whatever it is. We really didn't do quite as well as we might have hoped. The multilateral system has lost a certain type of purity that it once had with respect to non-discrimination, with respect to being this kind of rules-based organization. What I will nevertheless say, and maybe this is too basic a point to make, but what I'll nevertheless say is that despite all of this, despite the fact that things have been diluted towards bilateral sort of agreements and so on, despite the fact that you don't have a functioning dispute settlement mechanism, it seems to me that the multilateral system in its current form still offers a very, very good set of opportunities for India. Right? And the greatest example, proof of that may be just to see what China has done under the system, right? Under the current rules, right? Without any special deals, without any special trade agreements, China has done fantastically well. And despite the fact that it faced everything that it did from the US starting 2016. So in a certain sense, despite all of the drama and all of the concerns about what's been going on in the world trade system, I still think it's an outstanding platform for us to do whatever it is that we would like to do from an international trade standpoint. There are things we could do better, but this is not bad. Our bilateral agreements have been very shallow. Our raising of import tariffs has not helped. I think that, certainly think that our design of both our unilateral tariffs and our trade agreements should keep this kind of GVC type strategy in mind, right? And Professor Batra has written about this, talked about how other countries recently even have done very well designing trade regimes with these particular strategies in mind. It seems to me that we've not done that, and it seems like an important direction in which we could go. There are obviously particular trade agreements, including the CPTPP, that we could be pursuing and that we haven't done yet. And so with that, let me stop.
Yeah.
Back to you. I think I've gone over my time by a few minutes, but
Yeah, never
I
mind.
apologize. Thank you.
Thank you for a very detailed, enlightening, insightful talk. I'll raise some questions, both directly from your presentation as well as in the larger context. Keep it short because I think I'll open it up also for question and answers. But the very first point or the question that I'd like to bring forth, is you base almost your entire talk, you start with the premise, that as far as trade agreements are concerned, which have benefited many other countries, are contradictory to the basic premise of the WTO, and the WTO said, give up the non-discriminatory aspect, basically the MFN principle, and go ahead with the trade agreements. There is, that's the Bhagavati argument, I would say, but there is an entire argument counter to this, which is that Article 24, which allows trade agreements. And Article 24 allows trade agreements under the assumption, that these will ultimately form into larger regional blocks, each of them allowing for greater, freer, fairer trade, Although this would be discriminatory outside, but we know the principles as far as not having external tariffs that are discriminatory or any measures that are discriminatory to non-members, ensuring that it doesn't actually become fundamentally discriminatory, B, as far as the rise or the increase in trade agreements is concerned, it's also because of the nature of production that started to fragment across borders, which necessitated certain kind of trade provisions, which WTO, having stagnated because of the Doha development agenda, could not evolve itself into. So, I mean, do you think really it is, the fault lies with the system in terms of allowing for trade agreements? Or do you think trade agreements were a necessity that actually allowed for trade to increase multifold in the manner in which it did, in the late 90s, early 2000s?
So look, I mean, let me take one of your first points first, which is, I don't think that Article 24 envisioned necessarily expansion of these agreements into larger blocks, and that this was going to be some path through which we get to global free trade or anything like that, right?
The entire building blocks argument.
It was not already there in Article 24. So as these were being negotiated in Bretton Woods and so forth, there was this sense that primarily the Europeans already had this idea that there might be something like the European Union that was going to be put in place, and they did not want to sign on to anything that would prevent them from getting into an agreement of that sort. So as a concession, and this was strongly opposed by the US at that stage, but they finally conceded, said, well, all right, if you're going to have deep integration and you want to become some kind of one economic unit, then we'll permit this. It was not necessarily seen as a path through which you get to at all. At least that's my reading of that history. The other question I think is a very interesting one, which is, did you have an expansion of trade agreements because of production fragmentation and you wanted to facilitate frictionless flow of intermediate goods and so on between countries, or was this taking place independently? And I think both of these things are true. I mean, I can think of agreements like Mercosur as an agreement. I can think of, US-Canada free trade agreement almost had nothing to do with production fragmentation. The inclusion of Mexico did in fact have some of that. And so CAFTA-DR, which is the Central American Free Trade Agreement with the US, has very little to do with production fragmentation or the kinds of processes that you're seeing in Asia. So I think both of these things are simultaneously true, meaning countries for their own reasons, because they wanted to get access to each other's markets on a preferential basis, have gone ahead and signed preferential deals. And other countries, perhaps to facilitate the kind of trade flows that we would like to see, frictionless flows, especially in the context of GVCs, have gone ahead and signed those deals as well. I'm not sure I would necessarily pin all of the causality down on one or the other.
Okay, you also say, that China kind of moved ahead, without any major trade agreements, China always had a dual trade policy, where as far as intermediate imports were concerned, in order to facilitate the kind of manufacturing explosion that you're showing, that you've shown in some of your graphs, is, the preferential tariffs on the intermediate goods is what really facilitated its expansion as far as manufacturing is concerned. Plus later, the China-ASEAN FTA that allowed it to be able to take, that entire value chain, where it took the place or replaced Japan in the larger context of the Asian value chain, and Asian then integrated with the US, So, I mean, China, if not formally the trade agreements, did have the content or the elements of free trade agreements in terms of preferential tariffs to facilitate its movement forward as far as manufacturing is concerned. A, do you think this was in contravention of what was proposed by the WTO in terms of discriminatory, because it had elements of FTAs? B, do you think to a very large extent, as far as India is concerned, lack of understanding of what was happening in the rest of the world as far as dual trade policy, preferential tariffs, etc., were concerned, intermediate goods that were being facilitated, ultimately integration with value chains, is what did not bring about the necessary increase in productivity that has been the reason for other countries' growth, particularly China?
So no, I don't think what the Chinese did with respect to having lower tariffs on intermediate inputs was a contravention of the WTO, in the sense that you're free to choose whatever tariffs you want on whatever goods you want, except the WTO only insists that you have to have the same tariff on all of the countries, right? So if you have a lower tariff on intermediate inputs, you're free to do so. You want to have a higher tariff on an intermediate input, you're free to do so. It's not a contravention of the WTO. Could India have done something similar and achieved a similar sort of trade outcome? I think we could have gone a further distance than we actually have. I don't think that's the that's the only thing that drove Chinese growth. Clearly, they had sort of extraordinary technological improvement, whether it was through FDI or whatever else, in ways that we have not achieved. But some part of that story has to do with what you mentioned, I think, which is lower tariffs on intermediate inputs.
But as far as technological advancement in China is concerned, doesn't that come much later? It's the assembly large scale that precedes the advancement in technology.
Sure.
So it's not really technological advancement to begin with that really leads to that manufacturing increase as far as China is concerned.
I thought by the 2000s, they'd already begun to have some of that. Maybe, I mean, you could think of this in multiple phases, right? China in the 1990s, what happened between 1990 and 2000, 2010, what's going on right now?
I mean, we start to see the increase in domestic value addition as far as China is concerned in the latter half of the 2000s, really taking effect, I mean, it's 2005-06 that you start to see the increasing later, much later. And there are several explanations to say this was happening around the world because by then the reconfiguration of value chains had already started, So nothing exceptional in that sense about Chinese increase in technological advancement, productivity, etc. Would you agree with that?
I mean, my sense was that maybe you're talking about domestic technological advancement, but certainly they had plenty of FDI by then, a ton of FDI. And so I'm counting that as part of the technological advance, meaning they had investment coming in from the rest of the world, which brought in the technology. Maybe it was not Chinese technology, which is since then also taken off, right? In a sense, Chinese production capabilities in their own companies and so on. But FDI was definitely a big part of the story.
Okay, going back to the FTAs, you show that picture of very, very messy, overlapping spaghetti bowl, There is a, we have a similar kind of a concept as far as Asia is concerned, which is the noodle bowl set of agreements, A lot of it is said, has been resolved by, bringing in RCEP, for example, or a CPTPP. You don't show how that takes over with these, kind of not does away with the bilaterals, but it's kind of larger context. It provides a larger context wherein the bilaterals and the spaghetti bowl or the noodle bowl effects may not anymore be contradictory to the larger ones, They may actually, it's actually a convergence of these, in the larger context. So why not? I mean, why don't you discuss those as being more facilitative today of the kind of value chains that we are looking at, RCEP does it, for example, CPTPP is certainly capable of that. Would you then see these the appearance of the mega regional trade agreements actually doing away with the spaghetti bowl effects of trade agreements?
I agree with that a bit, which is to say that what might have started out as very complicated sets of rules on a bilateral basis have been harmonized somewhat in the context of the mega regional agreements. And so at least that bit of whatever negative consequences we might have feared from having these very confusing set of rules, maybe we need to fear them less, maybe considerably less, given the harmonization that we're seeing in the mega regions. And so if the question is, should we look at CPTPP less as some sort of spaghetti bowl and more as an opportunity to access a very large market that has its own internal harmonization, I agree with that.
Okay, I mean, probably, the last question that I will ask you, which is in terms of, when you bring in the WTO and you bring in the DSM, you completely, I don't think you've mentioned the alternatives that are emerging, we have this entire concept of alternative geometry that's emerging in terms of plurilaterals, Also, as far as alternative DSM, in terms of what has been proposed by the European Union, initially 7 countries increased to, I think, 46 or even more, 70 plus countries now, India is not a part of, or India has questions in terms of legality as far as these alternatives are concerned, in terms of plurilaterals. My question, twofold, how do you see the legality issue as far as plurilaterals are concerned, A, and B, how do you see India benefiting, or the larger context, of trade around the world, global trade system benefiting from plurilaterals, as against the WTO, which is dysfunctional and is not objecting anymore to the discriminatory tariffs or discriminatory trade policies that are being brought in by the US?
Okay, so on the first piece, the alternative structure that's being proposed by the European Union, right? So a set of rules, as I
Only for the
understand,
DSM.
only for the DSM. As I understand it, they're saying this could be voluntary, right? So this is a set of rules. It's going to look a bit similar to the old DSM. And if the US doesn't want to participate, let it stay out of it. And anybody else that wants to bind themselves under this kind of new structure is welcome to do so. It seems like an interesting option, given US intransigence on this matter, and given that the US is such a powerful player in the WTO and refuses to let the DSM move forward. It seems like an interesting option to me for India to consider. Right? On the legal aspects,
Just one bit. India is going ahead with resolving its disputes bilaterally, by the way, whether it's with the US, Brazil, otherwise,
Sure.
How do you see these multiple kind of dispute resolution systems evolving?
So, I mean, one could make the argument that, look, the DSM was a more efficient sort of structure, right? So you didn't have to worry about how powerful you are relative to me, with respect to me having to resolve my trade disputes on a bilateral basis. That was the whole point of the DSM, right? That you could have a very rich and powerful country was violating the rules. The developing countries or any other country had the opportunity to seek remedies and so on. Of course, if you lack that mechanism, you'll find other ways to resolve disputes. Maybe they're not going to be as much in your favor as a poorer country or a developing country when the dispute is with a larger part. And so this is not to say that the world is going to come to an end if you don't have the original dispute settlement mechanism. Clearly, we had a world before dispute settlement was in place, and we have a world now after dispute settlement, right? So if the question is, look, I mean, can we somehow survive and function in some sort of way that is not completely terrible? I think that's probably what's happening right now. And so maybe we'll find ways to resolve these things on a bilateral basis. Maybe there'll be these interesting alternative options that come up that we can sign on to, and for disputes with everybody else, we proceed through this EU proposed mechanism or come up with some other mechanism on our own. I don't think it's the end of the world. If
India's objection in terms of legality?
So that I'm not sure. I fear I don't know enough
Okay,
about
so we'll leave it at that.
how these things are structured and how
Because
legal.
there are multiple views on whether, I mean, there are different interpretations of legality, as against what India is proposing. Never mind. I think we'll open it up for questions from, yeah, please.
Thank you very much, Pravin, for a really informative summary of what's going on today in the trade area. I actually have 9 questions. I'll combine them into 3.
I might make it longer than my presentation, but
No, one deglobalization. Okay. Do I understand you say that, look, too much is being made of it, and let me say why I think that. If it is a case that IMF, etc., are still projecting 3% plus trade growth over the next 5 years or whatever, is that too bad in the context of slowing global GDP growth? Of course, I'm not sure which were the causations. Okay. So in that context, there's too much being made. Okay. And 2, connected with that, is sort of backlash against globalization. A lot of that is to do with deindustrialization of stuff. What I have been very puzzled about, that's been going on for 200 years.
Right.
That is, after all, as you travel by train from New York to Boston, you see a whole bunch of decrepit factories across. And this is true of Lancashire, this is true of Ruhr, it's been going on forever. So my question is that what is the difference today from what happened before? Why wasn't there such a backlash earlier? And is it to do with lower labor mobility, which may be caused by higher female labor force participation? I'm not saying that's bad, I'm just saying the fact, which means that if someone loses a job, you've got to find 2 jobs rather than 1 if you want to move. So my general question is sort of globalization, deglobalization, backlash. And connected with that also, in terms of the academic economic literature that I know, I'm not that fully up to it, is that David Otter and co have made their living in terms of, right, saying that look, this is the biggest one. Right. I have not seen, but maybe I just don't know, of papers saying how much employment has been created in the US or anywhere else because of higher imports. Because after all, and plus value added, that we know that if the FOB price of a Bangladeshi shirt is $4, you buy it for $40 in a store in the US. So 90% of value added is in the US. I'm just making up numbers, but these are sort of broad orders of magnitude. So my question is, in the economics literature, is there any calculation of, look, this business of saying that we've lost out all this stuff, both in employment as well as in value added? Anyone saying this? So, this is all connected with the deglobalization reactions, etc. I've been very puzzled by that. And finally, on the same issue, that are people not calculating consumer surplus for the vast majority of the population, particularly the low-income people, by getting cheap goods?
All right, so let me take the questions in order. The first question is too much being made of deglobalization. I think too much is being made of deglobalization. There's a very nice paper article in Foreign Affairs this April, I think, by Brad Setzer. He's a senior fellow consultant. You probably know him. Outstanding piece, which actually goes through all of these statistics and points out that despite everything that's been said about deglobalization and so on, the trends are continuing as they did before. And this, again, coming back to the same statistic about the Chinese trade surplus and so on, may be a good indication, as good an indication as any, that the kind of deglobalization people are talking about and worrying about is just not taking place in that same way. He talks about trade, he talks about services trade as well. He talks about capital flows, and there's a whole range of ways in which he presents the case about why deglobalization is not happening in the way that people had sort of imagined it had or would and so on. So yes. The second question was about why is deindustrialization today become so important in the way, in sort of informing trade policy relative. My understanding of this is that, at least I can speak for the US, I think. So I've been in the US now maybe 30, 35 years, starting in the 1990s. And starting, let's say 95 or so, all of the elections, presidential elections that have taken place since then, the election comes down to 4 or 5 states, right? And these are 4 or 5 of the deindustrialized states: Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and then you throw in something or the other. And these have been the states, right? And the margins of victory are extremely narrow. We're talking at 1% here, 1%. And so the focus, nobody cares about New York State, nobody cares about California. These are all Democrat states, right? And so the Republicans don't care because they're never going to win them. And the Democrats don't care because they already won, and so on. So the entire focus of the election is on what is happening in these 3 or 4 or 5 states, and how can we use the issues that people there are concerned about to win the election. Mm-hmm. And so these have risen to the top very consistently. This goes all the way back. George Bush Jr., one of the first things that he did after he came to office, being a committed stated free trader, one of the first things that he did after coming to office was to say, I'm going to put a tariff on steel. You might remember this. I think the 2000 steel tariffs, right? So why is a committed free trader putting on tariffs on European steel? Because he wanted to make sure he's going to win Pennsylvania again. He needed it. He wanted to be second-term president. Every first-term president wants to be second-term. And that was what he felt he needed to do in order to do that. So my sense is somehow the political configuration in the US has come down to a point where these states are the ones that are the most relevant, and deindustrialization is an important issue, political economy issue in these states. And this is the reason we're seeing the type of politics that we are. So what you're seeing as you take the train from New York to Boston is not relevant because these are democratic states anyway, for most part.
But can we have the others too?
Yeah.
One of the things I understand. The question was, economists worked and so forth. The question they're asking,
there is an excellent paper by Penny Goldberg on that deglobalization hasn't really happened,
Yeah. So the third question then very quickly is, have there been studies about the consumer surplus side, the fact that you're getting cheaper imports and so forth, and job creation, right? So I think now finally you're starting to see a bunch of papers that deal with job creation. Where have all those people gone that lost their jobs in manufacturing? Have they gotten jobs and services, for example, making the case that that has in fact happened, paper by Rob Feenstra. There's another interesting paper that hasn't been published for a while, but it's been floating around, that makes the case that cheap Chinese imports, right? While one might argue that trade with China has lowered wages for low-income workers, low-skilled workers, right? It's also the case that their cost of living has improved because of the cost of these imports, right? And so this is called the Walmart effect, right? Most their consumption basket to a much greater extent is focused on those goods that come from China, and they should have been improved a lot. They make the argument that, so this is Romalis, John Romalis from, he was in Chicago at the time that he wrote this paper, making this argument by very, very careful individual level examination of consumption baskets all along the income distribution, that this is in fact the case, right? These papers just haven't gotten as much traction as they should have, I think, in the political discussion.
Okay, other questions? We'll take two from different people.
Yes, I only have one.
Yeah, okay.
I agree almost to Rakesh's first one of how much is being made. I'm not an economist, so I'll start with that caveat. But while trade is a important or a necessary or a factor, confounding or dominating, what's the view on corporate policy? So if I look at US, China, which is one of the big trade flows, corporations didn't just like the cheap labor, but they made a certain amount of bets that China leveraged very well in terms of technology transfer, mandatory technology transfer, which they then not only bent, but broke and re-exported in their own name. And the flip side of that is, I don't think in history we've had an engine like China. The price at which it can produce goods is unprecedented, and scale. So are those more dominant factors? I mean, certainly you needed the ability to trade, which is what enabled, but India's had more ability to trade than what it's achieved.
So, yeah.
Let's just
so
take
sh-
two
yeah,
questions.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have three questions, small ones.
Make them
So,
very brief.
yeah.
Okay.
So the first one is on India, ASEAN, for example, focusing on the FTA. So while you said that it was under the enabling clause and there was a sensitive list, but we still see that there was a high trade deficit. So was it to do with competitive factors and related to structural problems like size, productivity, scale? So that is the first question, that despite having the sensitive list, we imported more than exporting. So that's the first one. And second, in terms of the sanctity of WTO, so what's your take on its role in dealing with the non-tariff measures these days, which are rampant, especially from the EU's end? So they introduce regulations, but they do not notify these regulations to the WTO. But these are definitely trade disrupting, and it impacts the competitiveness. Third one on the firm concentration. So I've also seen it, from the customs database for some sectors. So what I've observed is that for the firms which have high exports, they are actually the firms which also have high imports. So they are these firms which are more integrated into GVCs. So did you see the similar thing? Because the firms that are like that concentrate in terms of the exports also concentrate in terms of imports in terms of the volume.
Okay. Maybe we'll take, just a second one. Let's just take that.
Rahul, I'm also not just like Rahul, I'm also not an economist, nor do I know that much about trade. So I hope this doesn't sound too naive. But we're talking about the policy dilemmas for India, and you suggested we got to increase exports. I'm wondering where, and you said we are sort of out of sync with what is our competitive advantage. And if our competitive advantage is sort of lower skilled labor, isn't that space shrinking as manufacturing becomes more automated? And is it possible that we may, again, if we focus on this sort of low skilled manufacturing, that we may actually again be out of sync with what is happening in the rest of the world?
All right, so I'm gonna have to remind myself. So the first question was about forced technology transfers in China and whether that was not a concern. And I think certainly in terms of the discussion in the US at this point and the kinds of things that have motivated the US-China trade war already and what's to come, I think that is an important, right? How much of this was voluntary, how much of this is in sensitive sectors, these are all things being discussed, but there is a concern that China, through sort of various nefarious mechanisms, schemes, has managed to get technology and use technology in ways that has allowed it to displace the US in a variety of sectors and in a variety of sensitive sectors. And so the short answer then, I suppose, is yes. To the question about US-ASEAN trade and the structure of the trade agreement and so forth.
India-ASEAN.
India-ASEAN trade and the structure of the trade agreement. Sure, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily think of the trade agreement's goal as being to shut down the trade deficit or anything like that. So maybe the trade deficit would have been bigger if you hadn't had a sensitive list or smaller or whatever. And so I don't necessarily take away too much from that observation about the fact that there was a trade deficit. It was somehow, we chose a set of sectors. Maybe we needed those imports. Maybe we didn't. This is just the market outcome given the set of rules. It's not necessarily a worrisome development that in fact we ran a trade deficit. I remember your third question, I guess, about customs transactions data and the fact that large firms were also large importers. I did not actually notice that myself, meaning I didn't look for it either. But that's an interesting observation. And in a kind of an anecdotal sense, it supports an older idea, I suppose, about economists like to talk about learner symmetry theorem and so forth, saying in order to export, you need to import and so on and so forth. So that's kind of a within the firm illustration of that point. I'm sorry, I lost. Right. Yeah, so the WTO has not been great with respect to that. Even when the dispute settlement mechanism was fully on, you could say it was sort of so-so in terms of managing that set of issues. And now that dispute settlement is so much weaker, I think if that's the question you're asking, I agree that I don't think they're in a good place to manage this. On the question about, sorry, what was the
Low skill labor.
Oh,
And
low
are we
skill labor.
losing?
No, that's a very
big
interesting
space.
question as well, which is that, so on the one hand, the reality is that we have a lot of low skill labor, right? And at one level, it would be great for our system to somehow make use of it, right? But if the alternate vision of the world is that there's going to be machines that do everything that low skill labor can do, then it's not clear that anybody has a good answer for what one does in that sort of a scenario, right? I don't necessarily think that taking the position now that we should try and sort of, it would be a good outcome for India through its trade, through its exports, find employment for low skill labor. I don't think that sort of trying to find ways to do that is in any kind of conflict with other strategies that use services, for example, or high skill labor or capital. No one's saying, and certainly I'm not saying that you should only use low skill labor and shut down everything that uses high skill labor. Do that and try and do something about this as well, right? And if you have the fact that the robots are coming and taking over everyone's jobs, it's going to be a challenge.
Okay, we have a couple of questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Amita. Thanks, Pravin. Excellent presentation. I guess CSEP is going to circulate it. I will request Lavish to do that if that is possible. 3 quick points. First is on this point of design trade agreements, keeping JVCs in mind. Fortunately, this idea has started getting traction in our commerce ministry. So not much work has done. I mean, nothing, but initial thinking has started getting into their heads. So I am going to advocate with the commerce ministry to come out with a discussion paper by engaging trade economists like you, Amita, and some others. So that's one very quick point. Secondly, for the last couple of days, Indian newspapers, they're full of comments by some of our trade experts, not Amita, that we should take retaliatory measures against US if US imposes tariff. against us. I mean, extra more tariffs against us. The other important news, which was there in yesterday's Times of India and other papers also, our Commerce Ministry has already started taking, or rather not taking, but started their preparations for calibrated trade creation, trade diversion, oblique diversion in favor of imports from the US. Maybe they are going to focus on 6 or 7 less red states, maybe including Ohio, because from where Vice President wants come. And
Ohio.
Ohio, yeah. So, and naturally, he's going to be the candidate 4 years from now, 10.5 years from now. So we have to also keep that in mind. We have to take a little picture, not just what is happening today, but what's going to happen in future. My third and final point is that while the WTO's dispute settlement system is in a limbo, but I don't see the kind of urge on the part of other major players like EU or India or China to get US into a discussion table, if not negotiating table. I'll draw a parallel. I mean, you know that after Punta del Este, the Uruguay round, most of the things got sorted out, including IPR issues, including textiles, including on services.
Mhm.
But there was a huge stumbling block even after all that. That was on agriculture. And then US and EU, they sat together, several rounds of negotiations. Finally, the final round of negotiation took place in the
What's
Blair
your,
House.
can you come to your
Yeah.
question, please?
Blair House. But what do you think? I mean, do you think that I don't see that kind of urge on the part of other players? Do you think that we have reconciled to the fact that at least for the near future, we're not going to see much movement at the multilateral level? On the other hand, there will be movements at the plurilateral levels where the new capital, the digital capital, also have their interest. So what is your thinking on that?
But just 1 second. One last question. We'll quickly put these questions together. Yeah. One question, your question. Yeah.
If everything is going to become so transactional in the international trade front, right? I mean, cannot be policy stability on this. So even if Mr. Trump has a deal with China, you never know when that deal will break. So in that context, I mean, how do you make investment decisions? Given that, do you foresee a massive fall in global investment?
Okay, I think we're done with questions. Any more?
Very quick, sorry.
Short.
Yeah, very. The last policy option, design trade agreements and unilateral reforms, are the two linked? Because if
In
we
a
are
sense,
signing, so are these two distinct or related? And one, is there a dilemma for us? I mean, the title was that what are the policy dilemmas, or basically this has been the case for some time now?
The world is in a dilemma. I think what's going to happen. Yeah. So answers to.
So you
what we have. You
raised
have a
hand or
question?
was it a
Yeah.
question?
Okay.
Okay.
So one question I had regarding the BRI. The BRI has been going on
Okay, please.
for decades. And it definitely gives all the nations in the BRI edge in an advantage in both supply chain costs and more like capital expenditure. So overall, the costs for nations there are much lower. Does that put non-signatories in a place that they're in a trade disadvantage or the running a risk of becoming a trade desert?
It's a very quick, there's a lightning round. So the very quick answer is, I think the Europeans, at least to my understanding, have worked quite hard to try to get the US to the table to discuss the dispute settlement issue. They've clearly not succeeded. How intense these things were, I don't know, but my understanding is that they worked quite hard. If that's not going to happen, then the world just moves on, find other ways of doing things, maybe in the context of plurilateral agreements or figuring things out on a bilateral basis, that we was saying earlier, and so on and so on. But the efforts have been ongoing, and maybe they'll yet be successful. The question about policy uncertainty, yes, right? So incredible levels of uncertainty, great deal of, I think with respect to investment as well, whether it's going to cause an investment crash or not, I think that's a bigger question. But with respect to even something very sort of specific, semiconductors, right? Investments in the US, you know, what's going to happen with respect to the US-China trade relationship, US-China kind of, security relationship even in a sense, very crucial for these kinds of investments, right? And so on the one hand, there's huge incentives being provided. On the other hand, there's great reluctance. Let's say you make these multi-billion-dollar investments in the US, and then there's no need to do so because Taiwan Semiconductor can continue to produce in the way that it has for the past many decades. It's going to be a terribly inefficient thing to do to produce in the US. So people are taking it slow. I'm not sure that it's, the kind of policy uncertainty that you're seeing now would lead to a crash in investment, but obviously it creates questions. On the dilemmas, I mean, even something very basic as we were talking earlier, should you accommodate through some reduction in your own tariffs, unilateral tariffs, or should you retaliate if you have a huge amount of tariffs imposed on you? Should you emphasize, should you forget about bilateral agreements for most part and do the best you can under the multilateral structure? Or should you really focus a lot on trying to get into GVCs, think about ways in which FTAs could help you through that process, think about the ways, the particular unilateral tariffs that you need to reduce in order to facilitate intermediate inputs and so forth. So in a sense, these are the dilemmas, challenges, whatever it is that you'd like to say. On the BRI, I'm not sure that being outside would bring you into a trade desert, maybe as you put it. Of course, having better infrastructure and better facilities and so on lowers trade costs and allows you to trade more efficiently. So, having those advantages is probably good, but it's maybe not going to make you an island if you weren't part of it.
And not with the kind of terms that China sets with its BRI projects. Any other questions last, or we close it? Thank you so much.
Thanks so
I
much.
think very, very insightful.
Thank you.
Enjoyable.
Excellent.
Thank you.